Psychopath. Cure by Psychopath. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. In a previous video, I introduced you to the fact that there have been those that have sought to cure me, and they failed. It's similarly the case that there have been others that have sought to cure others of my kind, believing that many of the problems that the world experiences are as a consequence of the behaviour of psychopaths. One can understand that there is some force in that argument, and therefore they formed the view that if they could successfully cure the psychopath, many of those problems would be removed. Certainly that would mean that fewer people might find themselves subjected to being murdered or injured, robbed from, and so forth, and potentially, on a much wider scale, by enabling those that had got themselves, or were on the route to gaining power in a political or military or governmental way, would not be affected by their psychopathy in the wielding of that power. Of course, it raises questions as to how the psychopath would be identified in the first place, and undoubtedly the more sophisticated of our kind that have got themselves in a position of power would utilise that power to prevent their detection. Furthermore, there's also the question of ensuring that the individual would submit to a treatment if one could be applied. For those incarcerated, that would be relatively straightforward. But again, the more sophisticated of my kind would not find themselves in a position of incarceration, as no doubt you have seen on numerous instances individuals that you would identify as a psychopath have evaded the reach of justice and the law. But if we put those two concerns to one side, there are those that have believed that they were in a position to bring about a curing of the psychopath. And I wanted to bring to you, for your interest and education, a gentleman called Dr. Elliot Barker. Barker was a psychiatrist, and he believed that he had a method through a therapeutic community to cure psychopaths. The institution was called Oak Ridge, and this was a maximum security ward for the criminal insane at the Ontario Hospital in Ontario. The superintendent there, Dr. Barry Boyd, hired Barker in 1965. Barker had returned from a journey of discovery. He'd visited various places which included R.D. Lang's Philadelphia Association in London, and Maxwell Jones' Social Psychiatry Unit at the Henderson Hospital in Surrey in the United Kingdom. These were two of the time's pioneering attempts at therapeutic community. Many of the patients at Oak Ridge had effectively been warehoused and forgotten about as a consequence of the lack of resources of a professional nature to treat them. Barker had various radical ideas, and he was given this job. Elliot interfaced with the psychopaths that were at this institution, and he formed the view that because they were, in effect, burying their insanity deep beneath the facade of normality, then if somehow he could bring their madness, as he described it, to the surface, then it would almost blow itself out like a storm, and then they could be reborn as empathic human beings. If this couldn't be done, these individuals would remain imprisoned. Thus, his idea was that somehow their psychopathy, the madness, the problem that they were consumed by, should be brought to the surface, allowed to flourish, and in so doing almost burn itself out, and thus they would be cured. Barker sought permission from the Canadian government to obtain a large batch of LSD, and he handpicked a group of psychopaths. They were relatively young and intelligent offenders, and he took them into what was known as the Total Encounter Capsule. There, he asked them to remove their clothes. What he was about to embark on was nude psychotherapy sessions for psychopaths. These raw, naked, LSD-fueled meetings went on for days on end. The psychopaths spent every waking moment journeying to their darkest corners in an attempt to become better. There were no distractions in this capsule. They didn't wear clothes. They couldn't watch television. There were no clocks. There was only a repeated and sustained discussion, some 100 hours every week, about their feelings. They were encouraged by Barker to go to their rawest emotional states. They were encouraged to scream and claw at the walls. They were encouraged to confess fantasies of forbidden sexual longing for each other, even if they were in a state of arousal whilst they were doing so. Elliot was watching all of this from behind a one-way mirror. He decided that he wouldn't actually be the one to treat the psychopaths. In effect, what would happen is the psychopath would be cured by psychopath. They would be each other's therapists. Visitors to the unit were an inconvenience. Often, these would be groups of local teenagers being sent there to remove the stigma associated with medical facilities of this nature. This generated a problem for Elliot, and he didn't want the presence of strangers to permeate into the environment that he spent months creating. So what he ended up doing was he acquired some gruesome crime scene photographs of people who'd committed suicide, basically where they'd shot themselves in the face, and he hung these large pictures around the visitors' necks. So when the psychopaths came into contact with these visitors, they would be confronted by this violence. Early on, the psychopaths would stare angrily at each other. Time would go by, nobody would speak. Some of them resented that they were being forced by their fellow psychopaths to attend this program. They didn't like the fact that they were being told to discuss their feelings. They didn't want to. Others took exception to being forced to wear little girl-type dresses, which was a psychopath-devised punishment for non-cooperation. Furthermore, nobody wanted to look up and see a teenager looking at them through a window wearing a huge crime scene photograph around their neck. It all seemed that despite these supposed good intentions, that it was going to fail. Psychopaths were strapped to one another inside this capsule. They were suffering from sleep deprivation. They were being fed huge amounts of LSD. However, then something altered. A CBC documentary maker called Norm Perry was invited into Oak Ridge by Elliot in 1971. He makes a film, and in it, the prisoners are changing. "I love the way you talk," one prisoner tells another. Apparently, there's tenderness in his voice. "You just let it flow from you as if you own all the words in the world. They're your personal property and you make them dance for you." Elliot was delighted at this. His psychopaths had become gentle. It was even the case that some were explaining to their parole boards that they ought not to be released until they had seen through and completed their therapy. By the mid-1970s, Elliot stepped down, and a young psychiatrist named Gary Mayer took over. Mayer was a more hippie-like individual that took over. And he then recounted, I beg your pardon, he then ran Oak Ridge, taking over. He continued the use of the capsule. The fact is that the continuance of this, whereby they would engage in mass chanting, sitting and going om for half an hour, that they engaged in all of this, and the idea was that they would become better through doing this. It was also the case that they were introduced to schizophrenics to talk about their dreams. I've explained that I don't dream, and it is the case that the schizophrenics would have very vivid and repeated dreams, whereas the psychopaths didn't dream, or if they did have a dream, it was limited, and there was not much to say about it. This supposed idea of the exchange of dreams only resulted in further conflict between the two groups as a consequence of the fact that the schizophrenics would talk about the intensity of their dreams, which bored the psychopaths, and the psychopaths had nothing really to say to the schizophrenics about the dreams. This mutual exchange of dreaming failed to achieve anything. It would appear over time, however, that the extensive use of LSD was frowned upon, and in the end, Barry Boyd, the superintendent, told Gary Mayer to reduce the application of LSD. The fact is that Mayer thought that improvements were being made, but he deemed other psychiatrists and the prison guards as getting in the way of success. The problem was that Mayer explained that they would experience change. They'd be given the LSD, they would go through these marathon programs of basically providing therapy to one another, but then they would go back on a general ward, and that wasn't ready for the change, so that they would then regress. It seems to me, of course, that is blame shifting, to suggest that it's the environment into which they found themselves to blame rather than it actually being them. And consequently, there would be situations where serial killers and rapists would be running around inside this capsule off their heads on LSD. Mayer was eventually fired as a consequence of the concerns about allowing serial killers this level of freedom and exposure to drugs. And the idea was that he still believed that the process that had been put in place by Barker, and which he had continued, of the psychopath curing the psychopath, was a sound idea, that it allowed the psychopath's nature to be broken down and that they would be reborn as an empathetic individual. Entertainingly, in the early 1990s, a couple of researchers came along and decided that they would look at the recidivism rates of the psychopaths that had been through Elliot Barker's process. It turned out that ordinarily, those that were psychopaths and had been involved in criminal endeavours, 60% of them released into the outside world go on to re-offend. So their recidivism rate is particularly high. The researchers looked at the psychopaths that had been through the capsule that Barker and Mayer had claimed had in effect been cured. Their recidivism rate was 80%. Here you had two deluded psychiatrists who came up with a preposterous method of suggesting that a psychopath could be a therapist to a psychopath, not understanding that psychopathy cannot be cured. Their own arrogance and short-sightedness, their own blindness, their own hubris cause them to believe that through the application of drugs, through these ridiculous therapy sessions of nakedness, and clawing the walls and screaming at one another and talking about dreams, would result in them being cured. In fact, it just made the psychopaths worse. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.